Here are 3 true, unanswered horror stories. Story number 1. The Sodder Children Disappearance, a Christmas mystery that haunts history. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder family home burned to the ground. 5 children vanished in the flames. Or did they? For nearly 80 years, the disappearance of the Sodder children has remained one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries in American history. No bodies were ever found in the ashes, and strange clues suggested the children may have been kidnapped rather than perished in the fire. Despite desperate searches, no trace of the missing children was ever discovered. And over the years, eerie sightings, cryptic letters, and bizarre events only deepened the mystery. What really happened to the Sodder children? The Sodder family, a peaceful life in West Virginia. George and Jennie Sodder lived in Fayetteville, West Virginia, with their 10 children. George, an Italian immigrant, was a successful businessman who ran a trucking company. The family was well-respected and financially comfortable. However, George had strong political opinions, especially against Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator. In the Italian-American community, this made him enemies, and he often argued with others about his beliefs. Were these arguments harmless, or had they made him a target? December 24th, 1945, the night of the fire. Christmas Eve celebrations turned tragic. It was Christmas Eve, and the Sodder children were full of excitement. The older siblings had gone to bed, while the younger children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5, begged to stay up late. Jennie Sodder, the mother, finally agreed, allowing them to play as long as they remembered to turn off the lights and lock the door before sleeping. That was the last time she ever saw them. The fire begins. At 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang. Jennie answered and heard a strange woman's voice, laughing in the background. The caller asked for someone Jennie didn't know, then hung up. Moments later, she noticed the lights were still on and the door was unlocked, unusual since the children had been told to close everything. She turned everything off and went back to bed. Then, at 1 a.m., the fire started. Jennie was woken by a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling noise, like something hitting the ground. A few minutes later, smoke filled the house. The Sodder home was engulfed in flames. The family's desperate escape. George and Jennie rushed to save their children. They grabbed their youngest, Sylvia, 2, and escaped. John, 23, and George Jr., 16, made it out. But the 5 younger children were still inside. George tried to re-enter the house, but the flames blocked the staircase. In a panic, he ran outside to grab his ladder, to climb to the upper windows. But the ladder was missing. Desperate, he thought to use his trucks to climb onto the roof. But both of his trucks, perfectly functional earlier that day, refused to start. The Sodders could do nothing but watch their home burn. By the time firefighters arrived, hours later, the house was in ruins. Where were the bodies? The first clue something was wrong. After a thorough search, firefighters found no trace of the 5 missing children. In a normal house fire, bodies would be charred but still present. Bones, teeth, or other remains should have been found. But in this case, there was nothing. Experts later said that even at the highest temperatures, a fire would not completely destroy bones. But in the Sodder house, the missing children had simply vanished. Strange clues and unanswered questions. 1. The cut phone lines. The Sodders tried to call the fire department, but their phone lines had been cut. A neighbor later reported seeing a man near the house before the fire, carrying tools. Was he the one who sabotaged their phones to prevent them from calling for help? 2. The missing ladder and sabotaged trucks. The Sodders always kept a ladder against the house, but it was found hidden in a nearby ditch. Both of George's trucks mysteriously failed to start, despite working perfectly earlier. Had someone deliberately disabled them to stop any rescue attempts? 3. A firebomb on the roof? Jennie remembered hearing a thud on the roof before the fire started. Later, a neighbor found a small, hollowed-out object near the site, possibly a firebomb. Had someone thrown it onto the house to start the fire? 4. Sightings of the missing children. After the fire, people reported seeing the Sodder children. A woman claimed she saw them watching the fire from a passing car. A waitress in Charleston, West Virginia, said she served breakfast to 5 children matching their descriptions, with 2 men and 2 women. A hotel owner in South Carolina saw children resembling the Sodders with Italian-speaking adults. Had they been kidnapped? The strange photograph, 1967. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, the Sodders received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph of a young man with a note that read, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Illo boys." A 90132 or 35-inch. The man in the photo looked exactly like Louis, the Sodder boy who had vanished in the fire. But the sender was never identified. Theories. What really happened to the Sodder children? 1. The Mafia connection. Some believe the Italian Mafia kidnapped the children, either because George had criticized Mussolini or because he had refused to work with them. They may have burned the house as a distraction and taken the children elsewhere. 2. A child trafficking ring. Some theories suggest a child trafficking ring abducted the Sodder children. This would explain why they were seen with strange adults in different states. 3. They died in the fire, but the remains were lost. Skeptics argue that the children may have died in the fire, but their remains were accidentally destroyed or missed in the search. However, this does not explain the sightings or the photographs sent years later. The Sodder family's lifelong search. George and Jennie never stopped searching for their children. They put up billboards along the highways. They hired private investigators to follow leads. They offered a $5,000 reward, later raised to $10,000, for information. But despite their efforts, they never found out the truth. George died in 1969, still believing his children were alive. Jennie wore black for the rest of her life in mourning, until she died in 1989. Final thoughts. A mystery that still haunts. The Sodder children disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Did they die in the fire? Were they kidnapped? Or was it a mafia hit, a child trafficking case, or something else entirely? WWE may never know the truth. But one thing is certain. Something strange happened that Christmas Eve in 1945, and the Sodder children were never seen again. Story number 2. The Toxic Woman. The bizarre case of Gloria Ramirez, 1994, California. When Gloria Ramirez was rushed into the emergency room, doctors and nurses expected an ordinary medical emergency. Instead, what followed became one of the strangest medical mysteries in history. A case so bizarre that even today, scientists and doctors struggle to explain it. Within minutes of treating her, multiple hospital staff members collapsed, suffered from nausea, and even temporary paralysis. What was happening? Why did her body seem to poison everyone around her? And most terrifying of all, was Gloria Ramirez's death truly an accident, or was it something more sinister? The night of February 19th, 1994. It was a cold winter night in Riverside, California, when an ambulance rushed 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez to the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital. The time was 8:15 p.m., and Ramirez was in critical condition. She was suffering from severe heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, and low blood pressure. But as soon as doctors and nurses began treating her, they felt something was wrong. Within minutes, hospital staff collapsed, gasped for air, and had to be evacuated. Something terrifying was happening. The woman on the operating table had become known as the Toxic Lady. Who was Gloria Ramirez? Before that night, Gloria Ramirez was just an ordinary woman. She was 31 years old, a mother of two, and lived a simple life in Riverside, California. She was diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer, but was still fighting to stay alive. She was described as kind, loving, and always smiling, despite her struggles. Nothing about her life suggested that she would become one of the strangest medical mysteries in history. But then, on the night of February 19th, 1994, everything changed. The hospital nightmare begins. When paramedics arrived at Gloria Ramirez's home, she was barely conscious. She was struggling to breathe. Her heart was racing dangerously fast. Her blood pressure had plummeted. At 8:15 p.m., she arrived at Riverside General Hospital. Doctors immediately began emergency treatment. They administered oxygen. They injected her with drugs to slow her heartbeat. They tried defibrillation to restart her heart. But as soon as they cut open her shirt, doctors noticed something strange. A terrifying discovery. The strange symptoms begin. As medical staff worked on Ramirez, they noticed something disturbing. 1. Her body had an oily sheen, as if she was covered in a greasy substance. 2. Her breath smelled like garlic or ammonia. 3. Her blood smelled like chemicals, something unnatural. Dr. Maureen Welch attempted to draw Ramirez's blood, but when she inserted the needle, she noticed something horrifying. Ramirez's blood contained tiny, white, crystal-like particles floating in it. And then, one by one, hospital staff started collapsing. The medical staff begins to collapse. The first to fall, Susan Kane. The first person to show symptoms was Susan Kane, the medical resident assisting with Ramirez's treatment. She complained of dizziness. She suddenly fainted and collapsed on the floor. The second victim, Julie Gorczynski. Next was Julie Gorczynski, another ER doctor. She felt nauseous and started vomiting. Moments later, she collapsed as well. She began shaking uncontrollably, her body suffering from muscle spasms. The third victim, Maureen Welch. Nurse Maureen Welch, who had helped draw Ramirez's blood, was next. She felt a burning sensation on her face. She couldn't move her limbs. Her body was paralyzed. Within minutes, 23 hospital workers experienced bizarre and life-threatening symptoms. 5 of them were hospitalized. One nurse, Julie Gorczynski, had to stay in intensive care for weeks due to severe lung damage. What was happening? The emergency room evacuation. Realizing something dangerous and unknown was spreading, hospital staff made a drastic decision. They evacuated the entire ER. All patients and staff were moved outside into the hospital parking lot, except for one person, Gloria Ramirez. The toxic woman remained alone, surrounded only by doctors in full protective suits. At 8:50 p.m., just 35 minutes after arriving at the hospital, Gloria Ramirez was dead. Her official cause of death? Kidney failure due to cervical cancer. But nobody believed that was the full story. Something had happened to her, and whatever it was, it had nearly killed an entire hospital staff. Theories. What really happened? In the aftermath of Gloria Ramirez's bizarre and terrifying death, scientists and doctors struggled to explain what happened. Several theories emerged, some scientific, some bordering on the supernatural. 1. The DMSO poisoning theory, official explanation. In 1997, 3 years after the incident, scientists released a new explanation. Gloria Ramirez may have been using dimethyl sulfoxide DMSO, a common home remedy for pain relief. DMSO is a gel-like substance used for arthritis, muscle pain, and cancer symptoms. If Ramirez applied large amounts to her skin, it could have mixed with oxygen and medication, creating a deadly gas. When hospital staff drew her blood, This gas could have spread through the air, poisoning everyone nearby. But many experts reject this theory, arguing it doesn't fully explain the symptoms. 2. The hospital cover-up theory. Some believe Riverside General Hospital was hiding something. Was Ramirez exposed to a secret medical experiment? Did the hospital accidentally expose staff to dangerous chemicals, then cover it up? Why did the hospital refuse to release the full autopsy results? To this day, some believe the full truth has never been revealed. 3. The supernatural theory. Some suggest something unnatural happened that night. Was Ramirez exposed to a radiation leak? Was her body the host for an unknown, deadly pathogen? Did she undergo a strange medical transformation that turned her body toxic? Since no definitive explanation exists, many believe that the truth of Gloria Ramirez's death will never be known. The lasting mystery. Gloria Ramirez's case remains one of the most baffling medical mysteries ever recorded. Why did so many hospital workers collapse? What was the strange, oily substance on her skin? Why did her blood contain crystalline particles? Why did no other patients in the hospital experience the same symptoms? To this day, no one knows the full truth. What happened to Gloria Ramirez? Was it a freak chemical reaction, a horrifique accident, or something far more terrifying? Perhaps we will never know. Story number 3. The Man in the Vents. The disturbing case of the Denver Spider-Man. Sometimes, the horror isn't lurking in the woods, hiding under the bed, or stalking you from the shadows. It's already inside your house, watching, waiting. In 1941, Denver, Colorado, police officers responded to a report of gunshots inside a home. When they arrived, they found Philip Peters, a retired railroad worker, beaten to death with a blunt object. The house was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. The police were baffled. But the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. 4 months after the murder, Philip's widow and her neighbors heard strange noises coming from the house. Scraping sounds, whispering voices, the feeling of someone watching. But every time they searched, they found nothing. Then one night, police officers looked up, and what they saw still haunts them to this day. The murder of Philip Peters. Philip and Helen Peters were a quiet, elderly couple who had lived in their Denver home for decades. In September 1941, Helen was hospitalized for an extended stay, leaving Philip alone in the house. While she was gone, Philip vanished from his normal routine. He stopped attending social events. He wasn't answering the phone. Neighbors noticed strange movements inside the house, even when Philip wasn't home. Then, on October 17, 1941, gunshots rang out inside the Peters home. When police arrived, they found Philip dead in the bedroom. He had been brutally beaten with an old metal stove shaker. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked from the inside, and nothing appeared to be stolen. Who had killed him, and how had they escaped? The haunting begins. After Philip's murder, Helen Peters, still recovering from her illness, returned home, but she refused to stay there alone. She hired a caretaker who quit within weeks, claiming she heard eerie noises at night. Neighbors also reported seeing movement inside the house, but when they searched, it was empty. Some believed it was Philip's ghost. Others believed the killer had never left. They were right. The nightmare unfolds. By July 1942, police still had no leads in Philip's murder. Then one night, while investigating another disturbance at the house, an officer noticed something deeply unsettling. One of the kitchen cabinets was slightly open, and inside, a pair of eyes stared back at him. Something was in the house. The man in the walls. The officers rushed forward, but the creature inside the cabinet disappeared. They searched frantically until one officer shined his flashlight upwards toward an attic vent. And there, squeezed inside the walls, curled up in the dark, was a man. His name was Theodore Ted Connies, and he had been living inside the Peters house for months, possibly even years. Who was Theodore Connies? Theodore Ted Connies was a homeless drifter who had once known Philip Peters years earlier. Struggling with illness and extreme poverty, Connies had broken into the Peters house while Philip's wife was in the hospital. Instead of stealing and leaving, he found a tiny crawl space above the attic, just 27 inches tall and barely large enough for a human body. But he made it his home. At night, he would sneak out, steal food, and watch Philip as he slept. But on October 17th, Philip caught him. Panicking, Connies grabbed a stove shaker and beat him to death. Then, instead of escaping, he crawled back into the attic, hiding just feet above the crime scene. The capture of the Denver Spider-Man. When police dragged Connies from the attic, they were horrified. He was gaunt, skeletal, and covered in filth. He had been surviving on scraps for months. He never left the house, not once. When asked how he lived in such a tiny space, Connies chillingly replied, "It was cramped, but after a while you get used to anything." Newspapers dubbed him the Denver Spider-Man, a man who had lived in the walls, unseen, waiting in the dark. Connies was sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 1967. Final thoughts: the horror of the unseen. The story of the Denver Spider-Man is more than just a crime. It's a real-life nightmare. The idea that someone could be living in your home, watching you, creeping through your walls at night, is terrifying. And the truth is, it has happened more times than you'd think. Are you sure you're alone right now? Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more stories.